The black man stepped into the first-class cabin. His strides steady. His demeanor calm. But within seconds, the atmosphere around him shifted. Conversations dwindled into silence. And passengers' gazes turned toward him, some curious, some displeased, and a few not even bothering to hide their suspicion. A flight attendant quickly approached. Her professional smile forced. "Sir? May I help you?" Her tone was laced with implication. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he quietly placed his luggage in the overhead compartment and took his seat. But just as he settled in, the attendant's voice rang out again. Sharper this time, "Excuse me, but I need to check your ticket." Calmly, he pulled out his ticket and handed it to her. She took it. But instead of the usual quick glance, she scrutinized every detail, her eyes narrowing with doubt. Another flight attendant stepped over, glanced at the ticket, then whispered something to her. A nearby passenger let out a quiet chuckle. An older man in an expensive suit raised an eyebrow and spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps he's mistaken. Economy class is in the back." Scattered laughter rippled through the surrounding seats. A middle-aged woman shook her head slightly, pursed her lips, then turned away as if distancing herself from the situation. At that moment, the head flight attendant arrived, a woman with a cold, authoritative expression. She didn't even glance at the ticket before leaning in, lowering her voice just enough to make sure everyone could hear. "Sir, if you cannot prove that you belong in first class, I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to move to economy." Silence fell. No one spoke up for him. No one questioned it. The man's gaze swept across the cabin, as if memorizing every face. He could have spoken then. Could have silenced them all with a single sentence. But instead of arguing, he simply smiled, a smile that no one could quite decipher. Was it amusement? A warning? Slowly, he rose to his feet and pulled down his luggage. The air in the cabin seemed to ease as he walked away, as if his presence had never belonged there to begin with. But what these people didn't realize was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. What do you think about a man being treated unfairly on a flight just because of his skin color? Can you guess what will happen next? Comment your thoughts below before we continue the story. Marcus Sterling, a black man, walked into the international airport. He was dressed in a sharp suit, a perfectly white shirt, and a neatly tied tie. His short hair, thick eyebrows, and confident gaze suggested a strong presence. But deep within his eyes, there was an undeniable sadness. He wasn't a celebrity, but those around him couldn't help but notice there was something distinctly different about him. Marcus made his way to the check-in counter, where the staff were busy greeting passengers. He glanced around at the people nearby. Both business travelers and tourists rushed to prepare for their flights. But none knew that a man like him was the one who held the power to decide the fate of this flight. When it was his turn, Marcus placed his ticket on the counter and smiled lightly. "Hello," he said in a deep voice, though it carried an unmistakable confidence. Linda, a new flight attendant, looked up at him. She had never seen him before, but seeing a black man standing at the first-class counter made her somewhat skeptical. Her eyes quickly flicked between Marcus's ticket and the computer screen. After a few seconds of silence, she furrowed her brow slightly and looked back at him. "Excuse me. Are you sure you have a first-class reservation?" Linda asked, her tone revealing clear doubt. Despite her attempt to remain professional, she couldn't imagine a man like him being able to sit here. A black man, though well-dressed, seemed to be a mistake. Marcus stood there, unfazed, simply handing her his ticket while maintaining a faint smile. "Absolutely," he replied calmly, without a hint of hesitation. Linda looked at her screen once more, then glanced up at him. She carefully pressed some keys, then picked up the phone at the counter and made a short call. "I need to verify the information for a first-class passenger." But there was no change on the screen. Marcus's ticket remained highlighted in a shade of emerald green. Linda stole another glance at the ticket, then at him, trying to convince herself this might just be a coincidence. "I apologize for the inconvenience," Linda said, though her voice couldn't hide her hesitation. "You may proceed through security and board the plane." Marcus smiled again, saying nothing more. He simply nodded and walked away. But Linda's gaze lingered on him, unable to shake a strange curiosity. There was something off about this man. Her suspicions refused to be quelled. She quickly turned back to her colleagues, resuming her duties. After completing the check-in process, Marcus headed toward the boarding gate. He wasn't in a hurry, showing no signs of anxiety or tension. However, once he stepped into the first-class cabin, everything would change. Marcus sat calmly in the soft leather seat, his eyes gazing out the window as the plane began to take off. However, inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere grew heavy. Some passengers couldn't take their eyes off him. It wasn't because of his elegance or striking appearance, but because of the presence of a black man in this space. A space typically reserved for those of the proper class. As the plane started to move, one of the flight attendants, Linda, quickly approached Marcus with a bright smile, though her eyes betrayed a sense of discomfort. "Hello, sir. I'm Linda, the flight attendant for this flight. We're offering complimentary drinks. Would you like something?" Linda asked, her voice sweet, but with a sharp edge that couldn't be ignored. Marcus replied gently, "A glass of orange juice." "Thank you." Linda scrutinized him, her eyes lingering on his shiny black suit before she shook her head internally. She had worked in the aviation industry for many years and had never seen a passenger like him. A black man, daring to step into first class, despite his neat appearance. To Linda, he didn't deserve to be in this seat. As Linda turned away, she couldn't help but glance back at Marcus one more time. Her gaze filled with the suspicion that he didn't belong, as if he were impersonating someone of the first-class status. The feeling was as though she was looking at an imposter, someone who wasn't meant to be here, who didn't deserve to be here. After returning with his drink, Linda raised an eyebrow when she saw that he showed no reaction or special expression. To reassure herself that everything was normal, she continued with her work. But doubt still lingered in her mind. Meanwhile, Amy, a younger flight attendant, stood near the luggage area and whispered to Linda. Both of them stole glances toward Marcus. "Did you see that guy?" Amy asked quietly. "First class. He must be in the wrong seat. I don't think someone like him could afford a first-class ticket." Linda didn't respond immediately, only sighing. "I don't think he could have bought a first-class ticket either. But we can't do anything about it. It's probably just a mistake." "A mistake?" Amy scoffed. "Did you see his ticket? It must be a fake. How could someone like him afford a first-class seat? Anyway, as long as we do our jobs right." Linda nodded, though she didn't feel reassured. Her suspicions were far from quelled, and she couldn't accept that a black man could be seated in first class. A space that should be reserved for those of a different class. After a while, Marcus noticed there was no longer any special attention from the flight attendants. They still walked up and down the aisles. But every time they passed him, their gestures seemed to avoid him, as if they were keeping their distance. They constantly reminded each other of the first-class rules and kept an unusual distance. When Amy came over to serve Marcus his meal, she asked with a pointed tone, "Are you sure you're not in the wrong seat?" Amy asked, placing the food tray in front of him. Her voice no longer sounded inviting, but rather scrutinizing. Marcus looked at her, his eyes unwavering. "I'm sitting in the right seat," he replied gently, without showing any anger. He understood there was no need to explain anything. The truth would soon come to light. Amy didn't look at him again but quickly turned away, leaving behind a dismissive shrug. She couldn't believe what she had just seen. And the people around her couldn't accept that someone like Marcus could be seated here. But once again, Marcus wasn't bothered by their looks. When Caroline, the head flight attendant, came to check on the situation, she immediately noticed the discontent among the other attendants. Their eyes, their furtive glances, and their hushed conversations about Marcus were far from discreet. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm Caroline, the head flight attendant," she said coldly, not offering the usual smile like the other attendants. "I see you've been served properly." Marcus looked up, meeting Caroline's cold gaze without any fear or hesitation. "Yes. Thank you," he replied calmly, his tone firm but gentle. Caroline raised an eyebrow, her eyes narrowing as if she were studying him, although her face remained composed. Inside, she couldn't believe this man had been allowed to sit here. Still, she didn't want to escalate the situation, not wanting to cause unnecessary turmoil during the flight. As Marcus was gazing out of the window, he suddenly heard a strong voice coming closer. A middle-aged man, dressed in an elegant suit and exuding confidence, approached him. The man gave Marcus a quick once-over, then tried to soften his tone, but it was filled with contempt. "This seat isn't for you," the man said, his gaze full of suspicion and disdain. "You've got the wrong seat. Go back to the economy class." Marcus looked up, his eyes unwavering. He immediately understood that this was another form of discrimination, not just because of his status, but also because of his skin color. However, he didn't respond right away and remained calm. "Sorry, but I believe I'm in the right seat," Marcus replied. Not too firm, but still steady in his voice. The man wouldn't let up, a sneer curling his lips. "Who do you think you are sitting here? You think you have the right to be in first class? Someone like you should only be in economy." Marcus remained composed, but when he took out his VIP card and showed it to the man, everything changed in an instant. The man stared at the card, surprised, but after a moment, he sneered again and said with contempt, "A fake card. You think I'll believe this?" At that point, other passengers in the cabin began to glance over, but no one spoke up. They silently watched, with not a single person standing up to defend Marcus. Racial discrimination was still evident, but no one dared to speak out against it. Caroline, the head flight attendant, noticed the commotion and walked over. She stood a few steps away before quickly approaching them with a cold expression. She didn't check on Marcus but looked at the man with full respect, completely ignoring Marcus's discomfort. "Can you help me resolve this issue?" Caroline asked the man, her tone soft but authoritative. Marcus looked at her but said nothing. He could sense the discrimination in how Caroline was treating him. Although she didn't say it outright. Her attitude clearly expressed doubt about his ability to be there. As if he didn't belong in that seat. He doesn't belong here. The man continued. His tone growing harsher. I think he's faking his ticket. How could someone like him sit in first class? Caroline looked at Marcus without saying a word. Then glanced at the other attendants as if they were waiting for her decision. After a few seconds of silence, she turned to Marcus and said coldly, I'll check your information right now. Marcus smirked. Go ahead, he said. His gaze unshaken. I'm still sitting in my rightful seat. A few minutes later, Caroline returned after checking the information. She walked toward Marcus. The atmosphere in first class tense. She approached him with cold eyes and a firm tone, I've checked your information. And I can't accept this ambiguity, Caroline said. Her voice sharp like a blade. Your seat is invalid. I'm asking you to leave first class immediately. Marcus looked at her calmly. His eyes still unwavering. You can check again if you want. He replied gently but firmly. However, Caroline didn't seem to care about his words. She tilted her chin arrogantly. Her voice cutting through the air like steel, this is first class. Not a place for someone like you. You don't belong here. Leave now? Nearby passengers began whispering to each other. Their eyes all turned toward Marcus. A middle-aged man. Dressed in an expensive suit. Couldn't take it anymore. He turned to his friend with a tone full of contempt. First class isn't for people like him. An elderly woman sitting across the aisle also whispered. How could someone like that be sitting here? It's so strange. Then, a young man in simple clothes, with worn-out trousers and messy hair, stood up from his seat and walked straight toward Marcus. He wasn't rich, but his eyes blazed with anger and indignation. Despite not having status, he seemed to be the only one in the cabin brave enough to stand up for Marcus. Sorry, but I can't stay silent, he said loudly, looking directly at Caroline and the others around him. You can't treat him like this. He has the right to sit here like anyone else. The passengers around them began to look back at him. Their expressions unchanged, only shrugging with disdain. An elderly man sitting nearby glared at the young man and shook his head. You're just a poor guy. You don't understand class? Let the rich people speak. The young man didn't stop. Continuing, I don't need to understand class. This is about human dignity. Not money. He doesn't deserve to be treated like this. However, his words did nothing to ease the tension. The other passengers' eyes still subtly pointed and whispered about Marcus and the young man. They had no sympathy for outsiders. In fact, their gazes grew even more indifferent toward the young man. As if he was a fool who didn't understand the rules of society. Caroline kept her cold, arrogant attitude. She looked at the young man with derision but then turned to Marcus and said, He's in the wrong seat. And I don't have time to argue. If you don't leave first class right now, I'll call security. Marcus looked at Caroline and then turned to look at the young man, who had stood up to help him. Despite having no support from other passengers, despite them turning their backs on him, he didn't feel alone. He knew the discrimination wasn't his fault, but rather the fault of those who couldn't overcome their prejudices. He took a deep breath and said firmly, I'll leave. But don't forget I'm not the only one being treated like this. Just because I'm not like you doesn't mean I don't deserve a seat in first class. With one last look at the passengers around him, Marcus stood up and left first class without a word of complaint. But in his eyes, there was a resilience that couldn't be extinguished. The young man stood there, watching Marcus. But he received no praise. The gazes of those around him remained full of disdain and disrespect. No matter that he had stood up to help someone. To them, he was still just a poor man with no right to speak. After a period of time, the airplane gently landed, its wheels rolling down the runway before coming to a halt with a soft thud. A voice echoed over the loudspeaker, announcing that the flight had ended safely. The first-class passengers began to stand up, retrieving their luggage without so much as a glance at Marcus, the man who had been looked down upon throughout the flight. Caroline let out a sigh of relief. She thought the commotion with Marcus was over. He had been forced to return to the economy class with no one standing up for him. And in her mind, everything had been resolved smoothly. She believed no one cared about a black man being pushed out of first class. However, little did she know that the real nightmare was just beginning. As the plane door opened, passengers started to disembark, moving through the jet bridge towards customs. Marcus took his time, walking calmly, retrieving his bag and heading towards the exit. Meanwhile, Caroline and the other flight attendants were still checking the first-class cabin, preparing for the next flight. A voice from the ground staff came through. "Excuse me. Could the head flight attendant step outside for a moment?" Caroline furrowed her brows. She had never been called out immediately after a flight landed. Usually, she would only be needed for serious issues. Remaining composed, she signaled for Linda, one of the senior attendants, to come along. The moment they stepped out of the aircraft, Caroline sensed something was off. A group of senior airline staff was waiting by the gate, all appearing tense. And in the middle of the group stood a man in a sharp suit, with neatly cut hair and a calm but commanding presence. The man was Marcus Sterling. Caroline froze. Her heart seemed to stop. Her eyes widened, her mouth slightly agape in shock. She couldn't believe what was happening. The man she had looked down upon throughout the flight, the one she and the other attendants had tried to push out of first class, was the owner of the entire airline. The atmosphere around her grew thick, and no one dared to breathe too loudly. The senior staff bowed their heads in respect to Marcus, an action that made Caroline feel like her entire world was crashing down. Marcus took a step forward, his voice deep yet filled with authority. "Can you explain to me the service you provided on this flight?" Head attendant Caroline. Caroline opened her mouth but couldn't utter a word. Marcus' sharp gaze pierced right through her. Linda, standing beside her, was pale and trembling, knowing this would not end well. "Do you remember what happened when I boarded first class? What did you and your attendants do?" Marcus asked, his voice calm, but heavy with pressure. Caroline swallowed hard, trying to come up with an excuse. We were just following the rules. I thought you had made a mistake with your seat." Marcus smirked slightly, but his smile was devoid of warmth. "Oh, so you think someone like me can't have a first-class ticket?" Caroline fell silent. Marcus continued, "When a passenger insulted me and told me to go back to economy, what did you do?" Caroline lowered her head. I just thought." "You thought he was right?" Marcus interrupted, his tone icy. Caroline couldn't deny it. She knew any excuse now would be futile. Marcus turned to the senior airline staff and said, "The service provided by this crew does not reflect the values upheld by my airline. I will not tolerate people with discriminatory attitudes working for my organization." Everyone held their breath. From this moment on, Caroline is no longer the head attendant, Marcus declared coldly. She is suspended immediately. And the attendants who showed contempt towards customers on this flight will be investigated. If any racial discrimination is found, they will never work for my airline again. Caroline staggered, feeling like everything she had built was crumbling. After the situation with Caroline and the crew was resolved, Marcus turned to look at the senior staff and then exited the customs area. However, in his mind, he couldn't forget the image of the young man who had stood up for him during the flight. As he walked out of the customs gate, Marcus instructed his assistant to gather information about the young man. Though he didn't know his name, he clearly remembered the determined face and the courage he showed in standing up for Marcus, while everyone else turned their back. Soon after, Marcus' assistant found information about the young man. His name was Elijah. A regular worker with no position of power. Just an employee at a small cafe. This discovery filled Marcus with deep admiration. In a world full of discrimination and prejudice, Elijah had shown rare integrity and bravery by defending someone whom society had abandoned. Marcus decided he wouldn't let Elijah face these struggles alone. He wanted to help him change his life. Not just with money, but with opportunities. He wanted to make a difference. A week later, Marcus went to the cafe where Elijah worked. As he entered, the friendly yet hard-working atmosphere of the cafe made him feel the struggles of life there. Elijah looked up and recognized the well-dressed man at the door. He was a little confused and almost dropped his coffee cup. "Hello, Elijah?" Marcus smiled. "I want to thank you for standing up for me." Elijah stammered, You are?" Marcus nodded, not letting him feel awkward. "I'm not just here to thank you. I want to help you. You are a person of character. And I want to give you a chance to change your life." Elijah stood frozen, his eyes wide in astonishment. He had dreamed of a better life, but never imagined someone like Marcus would take notice of him. "Thank you." Elijah choked up. "I don't know how to repay you." Marcus patted him on the shoulder. "This is just the beginning. Elijah, I'll always be here to support you." Marcus knew that, although his actions were small, they could make a difference in Elijah's life, and in the world. Have you ever witnessed an unfair situation like this before? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you find this video meaningful, don't forget to like and share to spread the message. And subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories.